clothes for yourself is so rewarding, and that's why I'm excited you've chosen the Maker Box for garment sewing. Before we get started, let's take a look at what's in the box. In your box, you'll find your simple elegant tee pattern, rayon batik fabric, Fisker's fashion scissors, your Maker Box Notions pouch, which includes a seam ripper, flower head pins, thread, and Class A needles. First things first, let's take a look at your pattern. Inside your pattern bag, you'll find an image of the pattern, which also includes the sizes that you can make this top, the tissue paper pattern, which you'll use to cut out the shape that you need, and then you'll find a little bit of information. On this paper, you'll see that you have the finished measurements and some of your materials. So there's several different styles that you can make. You have a shirt with a cap sleeve, a dolman sleeve, which is what we'll be making in this video, and one with a kimono sleeve. So when you're looking here, this will show you how much fabric you need in a 44-inch wide fabric to make the top with the desired sleeve and length. And we'll go over that in a second. Then you have general directions, which helps you determine what fabrics might work best for this top. And then you have this larger piece of paper that is the basic instructions. But this shirt is so easy, I'm going to walk you through each step. So let's determine what size we need to cut out. So there's a couple of ways that you can determine your size. Your pattern actually recommends cutting out the entire pattern piece with all sizes included. And then you can hold it up to yourself and compare and decide which size you'd like. Just remember you need to keep a 5/8" seam allowance for your side seams. You can also measure yourself at the widest width for your bust and your hip, and then the smallest area around your waist, and compare the measurements included in your pattern instructions. So as you're looking at this very big piece of paper, it might look a little confusing and maybe a little bit intimidating, but don't worry, it's very easy. If you'll look at each big shape, you'll find in bold lettering the title of what it is. So here's your pattern title, and then right below it, it tells you this pattern here would be cut out for the kimono sleeve style. And as I mentioned, we're doing the dolman. So we're going to move our pattern over, and you'll find this one says that you need to cut this out for the cap sleeve. So let's take a look at the other pattern pieces and see if we can't figure out how to create one with the dolman sleeve. So if you look at both pieces here and here, you'll notice it says dolman sleeve A and B. So you'll also need to cut both of those out. And it says to match this line up with the cap sleeve pattern. So that's what's going to create our dolman sleeve with this basic T pattern. And then you'll see these long strips here. And these are bias strips for your neckline. And I'll show you how to cut those because they're cut a little bit differently on your fabric. But if you read further, this one's for your V-neck, this one's for your V-neck, and this one is for your scoop neck. And in this video, we're going to do the V-neck, so we need these two pieces here. Now there's two other things we need to decide. So let's take a look at your pattern instructions. So we've decided that we're doing the dolman sleeve, we're doing the V-neck neckline, but we also need to decide what length we're going to cut our shirt in, as well as how we're going to finish the side seam. So we've decided we're going to make the longest length, which means we'll need to cut all the way down at each edge with the longest length. And you'll see here it says cutting line for your long T on both sides. Then for your side seam, you can completely close it all the way down, or you can leave a little slit down at the hip area, 3 to 4 inches. And I'm going to show you how to create the slit in the side seam. Let's cut out our pattern. Since we're creating the basic style tee with the dolman sleeve, we can cut off the kimono style pattern. And I'm not really concerned with size just yet, so what I want to do is cut around the largest size available on your pattern. After we've cut out the tee, we'll cut out the dolman sleeve A and B, and then we just need the V-neck bias strip A and the V-neck bias strip B, and those are the only 5 pattern pieces that we'll need for this project. Next, we're going to tape our dolman sleeve A, and we're going to match the lines up where it specifies on the pattern. Okay, so you'll find that thick line and match up the corner there. And it might look like your lines aren't matching up here, but we're actually going to taper it in depending on the size that you end up cutting. And we'll do the same thing with dolman sleeve B on the opposite side. You might be looking at this pattern thinking how on earth this is going to create a shirt. But if you look at some of the notations here, you'll find that this is your back neck. So here's your V-neck. So here's the front of the shirt. It also notes here that this is your center front and this is your center back. And this is only half of the shirt. So we're going to cut this on the fold and it'll open out to another half. And you'll see it all come together as we progress. Now let's look at your fabric. Grab your fabric and open it up. And as you're opening it, you'll notice a finished edge. And you should have two of those finished edges. So as we open up your fabric, you're going to find both of those. Okay, we have a finished edge over here and a finished edge over here, and these are called your selvages, and from selvage to selvage, your fabric should be at least 44 inches wide. And to cut out your pattern, we actually need to fold your fabric selvage to selvage. So I'm going to open it out again, and you have quite a bit of fabric here, and we're going to fold it nice and even. My fold is close to me, and the selvages are going to be even on the opposite side. As you fold your fabric, for this project, it doesn't matter whether you fold right sides together or wrong sides together, because when you cut this piece out, it's all symmetrical. So we have our fabric nice and laid out flat with selvages even. Let's refer to our instructions again, just to get an idea of how we need to lay our pattern out. So you can take a look here and you can see our big pattern piece is going to lay right on the fold here. And then we'll need to cut our bias strips out a little bit differently. So first, let's scoot our fabric over so we can make the most of our fabric. And grab our largest pattern piece. So we're going to lay this out nice and flat, even with that fold, and we're not going to cut on the fold. That's very important. Don't want to cut on the fold. And you'll notice here, since I'm doing the V-neck, I've just folded that scoop neck back so that when I make this pattern again, I can cut out a scoop neck. All right, at this point, we need to pin our pattern in place. I like to start with my straight edge so that I know that my pattern is going to lay nice and evenly and is not going to move from that center line. Otherwise, you'll get a funny shape when you cut it out. You can pin as often as you'd like, but if you pin too closely together, your fabric might get a little ripply. So I like to do every 4 or 5 inches or more, depending on what project I'm making. If you pin something wonky, just take it out and readjust. I've determined that I'm going to cut out a size 10, so I can actually pin right inside that sizing. You don't want to pin across it. You don't want to risk cutting through your pins, because obviously that would not end well. After you have your pattern for your top completely pinned, we're going to look at the instructions again, and you'll see that you need to place your bias strips somewhere in the vicinity close to your pattern piece. So we need to scoot this over just a little bit so that we have extra space. All right, and you're going to take a look at these. And something you'll notice is you have something called grain of fabric. Okay, the grain is always parallel to the selvage. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that the grain of fabric line is parallel to the selvage. Okay, so you'll see in your instructions why you line it up diagonally. And I'm going to flip these over so that I can make that line parallel. So you can see I have a straight line here, and here's my selvage. And let's see where we can fit this one in. I think we're gonna have to go over here also. Okay, and if you look on the pattern pieces themselves, it tells you how many you need to cut. So we actually only need to cut one of these and one of these. So we don't have to cut through both layers. When you look at your blouse, it says you're going to place it on the fold and that you're going to cut one on the fold. Okay? As you look at these two strips, you'll notice that they're on a 45-degree angle, and that is called the bias of your fabric. That gives you some stretch, and that will allow you to turn the curves of your neckline. And you'll see just how we do that in a second. So you're going to follow right along the edge of the pattern. Because we're doing the longest length of the shirt, we're going to cut along that lower edge. And you'll notice that your lines will start grading towards the size that you want to cut out. So just cut along the size that you've determined for yourself. As I mentioned, I'm cutting out the size 10, so that is the line that I'm cutting along. As you come to the sleeve, you'll cut along the line for your size and then taper it into the same line on the body of the tee. Remember, you only need to cut one of these. I did cut two because my fabric was layered over and I just find it easier, but you only need one if you want to conserve fabric. One thing you'll want to do before you take that pattern off, you'll want to mark that shoulder line there. And I'm just marking it with a straight pin right here so that it's even along that edge. Okay, now you can take your pattern off. So to prepare your bias strips, you're going to need to grab your iron and your pressing board. And we're going to fold up 3/8 of an inch along the bottom edge towards the wrong side of your fabric. And if you've never done this before and think it'll be really hard to get that even 3/8 inch, just draw a line on your fabric and fold and press right on that line. And you're going to do the same thing with your long piece. Try not to stretch it as you go because bias is pretty stretchy and we don't want to warp it. And there's one more thing you need to do with these bias strips. After you press the lower edge away, you need to clip. You can see that mark there. It asks you to clip that away. Okay, you're going to do the same thing with your long strip. Alrighty, let's get our sewing machine out. To combine your bias strips, you'll just use that notched out edge to line your two strips up. And you'll want to make sure that you have right sides together. So that little edge that we had pressed up is going to face out on both sides. Okay, so we have those lined up. You can pin it if you'd like, and we're just going to stitch a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so when you open that up, you'll have that V, and that's going to help us on our V-neck. Now we're going to grab our main fabric and we're going to locate that neckline, and we've marked both of our shoulder lines. And what we need to do is just stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric all the way around, and this is called stay stitching, and it's going to give your neckline extra support so it doesn't warp. And I'm going to stitch very slowly over those pins. Normally I wouldn't recommend stitching over pins, but we need to keep those marks. So just make sure your needle doesn't hit your pin. You can even use your hand wheel to skip over it. and pivot at your V-neck. Now you'll just want to give that V-neck some extra support. So we're going to stitch about 2 to 3 inches before and after the V. You're just going to stitch right on top of that stay stitching line. Again, pivot at your V and just sew another couple inches up. One thing you'll want to consider doing before you finish off your neckline is to finish the edges of your raw fabric so that it doesn't fray when you wash it. You can use pinking shears, or I'm going to use a stitch in my machine that just stitches over the edge of the fabric, and this is called overcasting. And you'll want to do this along all of your raw edges, except for the neckline, because the neckline we're going to finish with the bias strips, which is what we're going to do next. So you want to find that V-neck and grab your bias strips and match the V's up. And you'll want to make sure that you are using right sides together so that seam that we had created is pressed open here and facing up. And then the wrong side of the garment is on the inside. And we're going to pin that in place. And then we'll work on the right side first because you have that shorter strip here. And once you get to that line that you marked for your shoulder, you'll simply fold the bias strip back. Okay, I'm going to pin that with an additional pin, and then we're going to cut off the excess that's overlapping the neckline. After you've pinned along the right side, let's work on the left side and then on around the entire neckline. And as you're pinning, try not to stretch that bias strip. Just lay it right, nice and even with your neckline edge. Here's my marking for my second shoulder. And I'm going to leave that in just in case I need that. And I like to pin perpendicular to my stitch line or where I'm going to sew because it makes it a lot easier to pull the pins out as you sew. What's nice about this bias strip is it follows the curve of your neckline because it has a little bit of give. Once you've met your other strip, overlap it a ½ inch and cut off any excess. Now we're going to stitch around the entire neckline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So now we need to clip the neckline so that it lays right when we turn it under to the wrong side. You'll want to clip all the way to your stitch line, not through your stitch line, but to your stitch line. And this is important because when you turn it, it will allow that V to lay nicely and it won't warp. Okay. Another thing you'll want to do is find any curvy spots around your neckline and cut some little V's into it. You can also trim down your seam allowance so that when you fold your bias edge in, it completely covers it. After you've clipped your seam allowance, you'll want to turn that bias strip into the inside and then press it really well all the way around the neck and pin it in place. And then stitch 1/4 inch to 3/8 inches away from that seam allowance to hold down your bias strip all around your neckline. And there you go, you have a nice finished neckline. You'll want to go around and make sure that you caught all of the edges underneath, and if you didn't, go back and touch it up. After that, you'll want to determine how long of a slit that you would like on your side seams. To determine the length of the slit, it's important to press up your hem 3/4 of an inch because you'll want to measure from that finished edge. So we're going to do 4 inches up. And I have both layers of my shirt lined up. And I'm going to place a pin right at that 4-inch mark. And we want to leave this edge open. So we're going to start sewing from here and work our way around this side seam. So pin both sides exactly the same, and then we'll take it to the sewing machine. Up to this point, we've been using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. When you get to your side seam, make sure you use a 5/8 inch seam allowance, which is standard for garments. Now that you've stitched your side seams, you just need to press these slits open 5/8 of an inch and then press your raw edge under to create a rolled hem along the slit edge. Now that our edges are pressed, we just need to stitch them down. And you're going to continue to do that on the 3 remaining sides. Repress your hem up 3/4 of an inch as well as the hem allowance on each of your sleeves. If you've overcasted your edge, you can press it up and stitch closely along your hem allowance on both. If you'd like to, you could also press it under again to create a narrow rolled hem. I'm going to stitch a 3/4 inch hem, and I'm going to top stitch closely to that hem allowance. And stitch the other side. And finally, you'll stitch down your hem allowances on your sleeves. And if you feel more comfortable pinning, go ahead and do so. Great job! You've created a garment from start to finish. Now you can use the pattern for many more. We'd love to see what you've created. So post your photos and join our maker community today.